welcome to the Muslim Viewpoint, a new video podcast series powered by the nonprofit national media platform American Muslim Today. I'm your host, Maya Gayler, and today we are continuing our Get Out the Vote series. Joining us is Dan Ruby, who is running for Oregon's 2nd Congressional District as part of the Democratic Party and Oregon's Progressive Party. Ruby currently holds a position on the Ashland School District 5 School Board. So Mr. Dan Ruby, thank you again so much for joining us today. So we're just going to start off by having you tell us about yourself and specifically your experience. I believe you are a school board member, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, so your experience as a school board member and maybe how or why that influenced your decision to run for Congress and how it might help you even in your journey.
Sure. So I'm Dan Ruby, and I'm a lifelong science educator and current school board member in Southern Oregon. And I am running for Congress in Oregon's 2nd Congressional District, which is about the size of the state of Washington. It's about 70,000 square miles. I decided to do it. I want to tell you a little bit about who I am and where I came from. I worked at the University of Nevada for many years, helping elementary school kids learn about space and helping high school kids plug into where they'll thrive, which is either university or college or internship and apprenticeships. And I got invited to run a science museum in Southern Oregon and jumped at the chance to move my family here because I love it. Went to college in Portland and have friends and family across the state. The first thing that we worked on at the museum was an exhibit on climate change because it's the biggest science question of our time. And in Oregon, how we experience that is through our forests and our waters. And one of the components of that is wildfires that are increasingly severe. And that became very real for me in September 2020 when fire started in Ashland and devastated nearby Phoenix and Talon, more than decimated 2 communities. So we lost 2,500 homes. And all of a sudden, just talking about something didn't feel like enough to me anymore. I had to do something. So what I chose to do was move into fire recovery work. And I worked with the fire rebuilding nonprofit and then with the federally qualified health center, working on transitional housing for fire survivors with health and human services wrapped around. What I learned from that is that we are far behind the nation in mental health, and we are last in the nation for youth mental health. That's depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, and substance use. And that became very real for me when a friend of mine lost their oldest child just a few days shy of his 21st birthday to an overdose. So that's another point. We're just talking about something didn't feel like enough anymore. I had to do something. So I chose to run for school board. And I was elected because I don't want that to happen to anybody else's kid. And the way you prevent that is caring for students upstream before something becomes a problem. But you can't just care for the students, you have to care for their families. And if you want to be effective, you can't just care for the families, you have to care for the communities they're in. So all of a sudden, I'm looking at what does it take to build a thriving community? And that's what got me into running for Congress.
Yeah, well, that's great. Such a personal story. And then, just kind of in my research, I noticed that you are listed on the ballot as both under the Democratic Party and the Progressive Party. So I was just kind of wondering, is that something typical for Oregon?
It is. In Oregon, you can be cross-nominated by minor parties. And so I have both the nomination of the Democratic Party by winning the primary and the Progressive Party.
And then can you just tell me kind of how the Progressive Party is different from the Democratic Party, like on their platform points or anything?
Yeah, really the biggest one is in foreign policy stuff. So Progressive platform diverges from the Democratic Party largely in how we want to fund or not fund military action across the globe. And very specifically in Gaza, what we see is the Democratic Party continuing to fund massive military aid to Israel and not provide humanitarian support. And so that's where I break from the Democratic Party.
Well, since you mentioned it, Mr. Ruby, it is one of my questions, but I'll go ahead and kind of move it up. Gaza is something that AMT has covered very extensively, especially since October 7th. But as you may know, this issue goes, decades. However, in Oregon, Portland teachers made the news for publishing a Know Your Rights guide about how to organize for Palestine, specifically in the public schools, and how to address, violence either there or here, legal issues, things like that. They have joined communities across the nation of activists who are speaking out on this issue and protesting these horrific actions being carried out by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And they're also protesting the Biden administration's military support for this violence in Gaza. So yeah, can you just kind of elaborate on, where you stand, your thoughts, and then also your thoughts on Americans who are speaking out on this issue?
Yeah, and I want to be super clear that when I joined this race, my intent was to really focus on domestic stuff, and that's housing and healthcare and education in my community. But you cannot do that with blinders on and with ignoring what's going on around the world. And especially because as a school board member, my number one thing is I want kids to thrive. I don't want kids to suffer. And it's unconscionable that there are tens of thousands of children in Gaza that are not only not thriving, they're dying. And so that's the lens that I look at this through. If I were elected, I would support other progressives. Like the most recent one was what was that? The Progressive Caucus had the House bill that was. I mean, it's simple stuff: ceasefire, humanitarian aid, stop funding military action. That's the way the majority of the citizens of the United States feel. That's what the United Nations says. The world is behind stopping that conflict and stopping the devastating loss of life.
Right, and then so as a Democrat, as a progressive specifically, can you tell us maybe your thoughts on the Harris-Walz ticket versus maybe a third-party ticket, maybe specifically the Green Party, Stein and Ware, who have been more outright against our support for Israel? So can you kind of just tell us maybe if you're persuaded one way or another, or how you might think voters might react to this?
My thought is that I am glad to see folks using all the tools available to them in a free country to make their voice heard. And it is effective. Sometimes just voting isn't enough because you're voting for a candidate with a whole complex suite of policies that they want to carry out and platforms that they stand on. And so really specific can get lost in the noise. And that's where things like campus protests are great. I fully support that. Your last question was, how do I feel about that? I watched that be a really sensitive thing on a national level I feel like some folks are afraid to have a strong stance on this. Probably can understand that depending on where folks' funding comes from. Your job as a representative is to not only represent the folks that you serve, but also to have a solid set of values. And so I guess that's what I'll say about that. I think there's probably room for more folks echo the majority of the citizens of the United States and around the globe.
Right. Thank you for that. And then just kind of bringing it back home to Oregon, although there is a relatively small Muslim population outside of, the Portland area, can you kind of just tell us maybe about the minority community in your district, whether it be Muslims, non-Muslims, and how you have reached out to them?
Yeah, so I am proudly endorsed by the Center for Free Thought Equality, which is a group that endorses freedom for and from religion, supports folks kind of across beliefs. I think it's really important that we separate church and state and not have, what we see in a really, really conservative district like this is a blurring of and confusion of fundamentalist Christian values with political values. In my entire career, I've always worked with folks regardless of how they vote. I don't even know how they're registered. I don't know what their family makeup is like. I don't know how they worship. That's not what you do at work. In a workplace, you keep that stuff separate and you do the job that you need to do. And that's the way I approach politics. I would say that to get the message out that I would represent all Oregonians in my district.
Yeah, and I'll touch on your point. I don't remember the incumbent's name, but I do remember he is a Republican in your district. So can you maybe just give us a few key points as to what you would change or address if you are elected to the seat?
Yeah, so I want to build, safe, prosperous communities. And at the top of the list of how we get there is going to be housing we can afford, better mental health care, and education opportunities, especially for career and technical education through our community colleges so people can get training for good paying jobs, union jobs in the industries that we've got and as our industries evolve. My opponent's top three priorities are still being against dam removal in Idaho and Washington on the Snake River, delisting the wolf as an endangered species, which affects the 1% of us that are ranchers, but for the 99% of us that are not ranchers in the state, it is also important, but maybe not at the top of my list. And then his third thing is perpetuating this false narrative that we have a flood of criminals entering the U.S. through our southern border, which is just not true. And so this problematic narrative that we've seen recently in very recent days is xenophobic and dangerous. It's just wrong. But he was part of the small group that was voting to impeach Homeland Secretary Mayorkas, and that didn't go anywhere. I mean, that didn't get traction with Senate Republicans. So those are his top three priorities, and I just don't think that that's how you get to thriving community. Our priorities are different. He votes against programs that would help vets, programs that would help seniors, programs that would help students, programs that would help working families. He votes against stuff. He has not originated policies or programs that help Oregonians in our district. So he's had, in the last session, he had one bill that made it out of committee and none that become laws. And I see the job as different. Number one, representing everybody in your district, regardless of their beliefs and regardless of whether or not you agree with them. You're still their representative. The other thing is it's really important to be hardworking in originating policies and programs, not just voting on stuff as it comes up, but originating things that to help the folks in your district.
So unlike Texas, Oregon doesn't really have, limited access to abortion. There's not as many restrictions. After the overturn of Roe v. Wade a couple years ago, now the decision for women's health care is being left up to the states as individuals. Do you believe this is the best plan for women's health care, or would you propose more federal legislation?
Oh, we need to go back to federally restoring our rights at a national level. And part of the reason is, even though, as you pointed out, we're quote unquote safe in Oregon, we're not at risk of losing our rights to abortion care or any other women's health care, life-saving stuff anytime soon. Huge crisis for us because we see folks from around the country, largely from Idaho. And we can't, in rural Oregon, we are not set up for the kind of increase in demand that puts on our systems. And it also is inequitable. I mean, folks that are able to travel are able to and can come to places like Oregon, but folks that can't are at risk of bad health outcomes. I guess I'll just put it that way. And we can't leave it to the states because that means increased load in states where it's legal, and deaths in states where it's not. So I feel very, very strongly that needs to be restored at the national level.
Yeah, and then just moving on to my last question, you've touched on it, and it is one of the key issues for voters. It's the economy, inflation, and rent increase. You've backed Harrison Wall's plan to aid home buyers. And then can you just tell us more about what your proposal would be to solve this solution, not just in your state, but nationwide?
Yeah, there's three things. And so aid for home buyers, because the aim is building generational wealth, especially for folks that have not had access to that historically. And that the proposed plan for $25,000 assistance for first-time home buyers is a way to do that. So end-user assistance for folks to own or rent, but owning is the goal. Change in land use policies that are outdated and incentives for local developers with union labor to be able to build below market rate housing. In our area, that's especially important when housing is devastated by fire. We lose homes to fire, and so we need to build housing that's affordable, not only affordable housing is houses that are 40 years old. You can't build a 40-year-old house. What you can do is build a new house below market rate with incentives, and those need to be next generation techniques that are ecologically conscious and fire-wise in our area. And then the third thing is getting predatory investors, so private equity, out of our homes. That's something that our Senator Merkley has been working on, and that's something I would very much support. So those are the three ways nationally to help make homeless more affordable. I also think that I very much support the cap on medication costs, cap on inflation of costs of everyday items and groceries. Those are being done by corporations that are making record profits. So we have a lot of room to tax international corporations and the mega wealthy billionaires and multi-billionaires and soon to be trillionaires a lot more than we currently do, while cutting taxes on everyday folks. Most of the folks in my district are struggling. They maybe make too much to qualify for benefits, but they can't make ends meet. They spend more than a third of their income on housing, and they're employed, but they have no savings. They are one unforeseen circumstance away from disaster, living in their car or being on the streets, and that's a kid getting sick or a car breaking down or an extreme weather event. And those are the folks that we can cut taxes on, and we can raise taxes on folks that can't afford it.
All right, well, that's all I have for you today, Mr. Ruby. Thank you so much for joining us.